In this video, we'll go over some rules that are either misunderstood or just kind of niche and don't come up very often, so it's really easy to get them wrong. And at number 10, we'll start off with something light, and that is the calculation for maximum fall damage. You see, when you fall in D&D, you take 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 10 feet that you fall, and you fall 500 feet a turn. So if you fall off a cliff that's 500 feet high, the maximum fall damage you can take is 20d6, as fall damage caps out at 200 feet. And the thing that's commonly misunderstood about this is the cap for fall damage. As in some games I've played in and even some videos I've seen on D&D, I've heard the fall damage maximum was said to be 100 feet for only 10 d6 bludgeoning damage. And then when I was double checking the maximum fall damage for an encounter with a rock that I was setting up, where I had planned on it pulling players to the maximum amount in order to drop them for fall damage, I was surprised to learn that it's actually 200 feet and not 100. Although I'm not exactly sure how often people misunderstand this rule, which is why it's only the number 10 spot. And at number 9, we have silvered weapons. There are some creatures and monsters that are resistant or immune to all weapon damage, except by the damage from weapons that are magical or silvered. And according to the DMG, you can pay a blacksmith 100 gold to silver any weapon of your choice, just in case you run into a monster which is immune to non-magical attacks, and you're in a low magic item campaign. Like werewolves, which are just straight up immune to non-magic attacks that aren't silvered. Or if you have lots of devils, like the Ice Devil for example, which is resistant to all non-magical attacks that aren't silvered. So it seems like just paying 100 gold to silver one of your weapons would make you set for the rest of the campaign. However, because there are a lot of common creatures that make an exception for silvered weapons, it's commonly misunderstood that silvered weapons basically count as magical weapons. So if you're fighting a creature like a vampire who is resistant to non-magical weapons, then a silvered weapon doesn't actually deal full damage against them, which is kind of ironic because silver is one of the weaknesses of vampires in some forms of vampire fiction. But unless the creature specifically says that a silvered weapon can bypass their resistances or immunities, then silvered weapons just act like normal non-magical weapons. And at number 8, we have ranged attack rolls in melee. If you're performing an action that requires a ranged attack roll, with something like a longbow or just a cantrip like Firebolt, then, if you attack a creature who's within melee range of you and 5 feet, you have disadvantage on that attack roll. However, this disadvantage actually occurs if you have any hostile target that's within 5 feet of you, no matter what your actual target is. So if you're trying to hit a creature that's 100 feet away from you with a Firebolt, and you have an unfriendly creature within 5 feet of you, then you have disadvantage on that attack roll. And the commonly misunderstood rule here is that most people believe the disadvantage only comes if you're trying to attack someone in melee range with a ranged attack. So if you primarily use ranged attacks, you really want to make sure nothing is nearby at all times, unless you have the crossbow expert feat, which allows you to attack with the ranged attack rolls with no disadvantage even if you have someone within 5 feet, and even if it's not a crossbow attack. And at number 7, we have Concentration and Spellcasting. This one is a ruling that I've heard from some people online that commonly messes up newer players. And the misunderstanding here is that while concentrating on a spell, you can't cast other spells. Which is not true. If you're concentrating on a spell, as long as you have actions available, you can cast whatever other spell you want. The only problem is, if you try to cast a spell that requires concentration while you already have concentration. In which case the previous concentration will simply drop immediately and you'll be able to use a new spell no problem. And casting other non-concentration spells while you're concentrating on a spell doesn't actually cancel the concentration. And also a reminder on how concentration breaks from damage. If you take any amount of damage while concentrating on a spell, then you have to succeed a DC 10 Constitution saving throw or else you lose that concentration. And if the damage is higher than 20, that might increase the DC of the saving throw as the DC is 10 or half the damage you took, whichever is higher. Most of the cases though, the DC is just 10, but if you're getting hit really hard as a spellcaster taking more than 20 damage, then eventually half damage will exceed 10 and you'll have harder saving throws. Which is good to know if you're trying to break the concentration of a boss monster. And also, you have to take a Constitution saving throw for each instance of damage. So if you hit a boss with a magic missiles that hits 3 times, then that's 3 concentration saving throws. And you know what's never misunderstood? How about some beautiful fold-out maps? You can't really get an easy fold-out map wrong. The Moonlight Maps Kickstarter includes over 100 fold-out maps with great environmental art that are dry erase, so you can draw and clean away easily to suit your encounter needs. And it also has some encounter cards which are very detailed for how to use them with some of the maps. Having foldable maps that are pre-gridded is just very convenient for tabletop play, as it saves you a lot of prep work as a DM while also giving you cool looking maps to play on. So, make sure to go check out the Kickstarter. It only has a few more days left as of uploading this video. Link will be in the video description. Now to continue on with more rulings that everybody gets wrong. And at number 6, we have identifying magic items. The misunderstanding. In order to identify a magic item, you must use the first level spell, Identify. The actual rule, you can identify a magic item over a short rest. The Identify spell is simply the fastest way to reveal an item's properties, not the only way to know what a magic item does. However, there is a variant rule for more difficult identification, which basically states that you need to use the Identify spell in order to know the properties of a magic item. This is another one where I didn't actually know the ruling of this one for the longest time, and always assumed you needed to use Identify in order to know what a magic item did. I'm not sure how common this ruling is messed up, but it's definitely one I thought I would include in this video, as the way I've been doing it nearly my entire D&D career is basically just a variant rule to make it harder and not the default one. And at number 5, we have spells cast from magic items. The misunderstanding. Casting a spell from an item counts as the item casting the spell. The actual ruling is that any item which casts a spell basically treats it as if you cast the spell, and the item simply gives you the ability to use that spell. Unless the item specifically states otherwise, like some legendary or artifact weapons that specifically say they hold concentration on certain spells and not you. So if you're using a magic item like the Brazier of Command Fire Elementals, where basically all it does is allow you to cast Conjure Elemental, then you have to keep concentration on that spell, and it's not in fact kept by the item. Again, unless the item specifically says it does, like the legendary item Black Razor, which can cast the haste spell on you once per day and mentions in its text that it's able to maintain concentration so you don't have to. And this also means the downsides of spells apply to you as well, like if you use a Luck Blade in order to cast the Wish spell for something that's not an 8th level or lower spell. However, if you simply give the item to someone who can't cast spells anyway, then it's not really a big deal if they can never use Wish again. So having an item with Wish on it is still very valuable as long as you pass it around to everyone to use all of its charges on unconventional wishes if you get multiple wishes. And at number 4, we have advantage and disadvantage stacking. The misunderstanding. Having multiple instances of advantage will override one instance of disadvantage, and allow you to have advantage on your attack roll. The actual ruling is that if you have multiple instances of advantage and disadvantage, they just cancel each other out, and the roll is done like normal. Which also means, if for some reason you have advantage in like 5 different ways, but one singular way of getting disadvantage, then it completely negates all of it, and the attack, skill check, or saving throw is done with a normal roll. Because no matter how many instances of advantage you stack on top of it, just one instance of disadvantage will completely cancel everything out, as they don't stack. So it doesn't matter if you have multiple instances, which also means if you have a whole bunch of disadvantage for whatever reason, maybe you're trying to shoot a ranged weapon attack with the target in melee range and you're poisoned, just as long as you have one instance of advantage, it cancels it out and it's a normal attack roll. Normally, getting advantage and disadvantage is kind of difficult, but if you employ the variant flanking rule, then advantage comes up a lot more often than normal, and this is definitely a good rule to be aware of, especially for classes which can't use their features if they have disadvantage, like how sneak attack just cannot be used at all if you have disadvantage on the attack roll. And at number 3, we have the surprise round. The misunderstanding. You sneak up on a group of enemies and they don't notice you, and you initiate combat. You get a full round to attack them while they can't do anything until the second round. The actual ruling is that there's no such thing as a surprise round, and just the surprise-like condition, which is just called surprise. However, the way surprise works is very similar to what a surprise round sounds like, just with a few differences. The way surprise actually works is when you initiate combat with an enemy group, you first check to see if the creatures are surprised or not, which is determined if one group is hidden and performs stealth checks, and the other group has passive perceptions that are lower than the stealth rolls of the people who are trying to sneak up on them. Then you roll initiative, and if the creature is surprised during their turn in combat, then they can't take any actions or move until the end of their turn, after which they're no longer considered surprise, which means almost nothing until their next turn, other than the fact that they can now use their reactions, where previously the reactions were not usable until their surprise-like condition was lifted. And since they lose surprise as soon as their turn ends, That means if you're playing a creature or class which requires a target to be surprised in order to gain advantages, like a doppelganger or an assassination rogue, that does mean you need to beat the target in the initiative roll in order to gain those benefits or those features. So if you're playing one of those two things and you go last in the initiative order, then you won't actually be able to use any of your special features, which heavily incentivizes them wanting to have high initiative rolls, like taking the alert feat, which gives you a +5 to your initiative. And also, a few other things to note. If your entire group is trying to sneak up on someone and one of your party members has just a really terrible stealth roll, then it's possible for them to alert everyone and completely ruin that surprise condition. Because if a creature notices just a single threat at the start of combat, then they don't have that surprise-like condition. Additionally, some creatures of a group can be surprised and some creatures might not be, as it's not an all-or-nothing situation. So if you're trying to ambush a group of bandits and they have a couple of creatures which have very high passive perceptions, they might not be surprised while everyone else is. And also, if the creature is not surprised, they can't use their turn to alert everyone else to danger, so that removes their surprise. And at number 2, we have natural 20s. The misunderstanding. You're trying to convince a king to hand over his kingdom and roll a natural 20 on your persuasion roll, so you succeed and become the new king. The actual ruling is that rolling a natural 20 for a skill check or saving throw doesn't guarantee a success or failure. However, rolling a natural 20 for an attack roll or a death saving throw does have some special features, where rolling a 20 on an attack roll means you'll always hit and perform a critical strike even if your attack is lower than the target's AC. And rolling a 20 on a death saving throw will get you back up automatically and is only worth mentioning because it's technically a saving throw, whereas none of the other saving throws have this feature. So if you're trying to save from an ancient red dragon's fire breath, and the DC is higher than what you can possibly roll in your dexterity, then there's no possible way for you to succeed even if you roll a 20, and you just take the full damage. Or if you're trying to convince a king to give over his kingdom and you roll a natural 20 for your persuasion roll, then maybe the king will just laugh off your attempts and not call the guards. But you do not automatically get a successful outcome. You just might fail less if your DM is generous. Since there are things in the game which guarantee a success if you do roll a natural 20, it makes sense why this rule is commonly misunderstood. It might possibly be one of the most misunderstood rulings in the game. However, I've also seen tons of people who know that it's so commonly misunderstood that they actually know the real ruling of it, so I only have this at number 2 spot on this list. Basically, because it's so commonly misunderstood, it kind of goes full circle and actually isn't that misunderstood anymore, which is not really the case with number 1 on this list. And at number 1, the most commonly misunderstood rule that I see all the time is bonus action spellcasting. The misunderstanding. You're playing a cleric and you want to heal 2 of your party members who went down in your previous turn. So you use your bonus action to cast Healing Word on one of them, then you run up to another party member and use your action to cast Cure Wounds. The actual ruling? If you use your bonus action to cast any spell, then you're not allowed to cast any other spell for the rest of the turn unless it is a cantrip that requires 1 action to cast. However, this ruling is often misunderstood even further, where people who know this ruling commonly mistake it to assume no spells can be cast 2 times in 1 turn. So let's set up a situation. You're trying to cast a fireball, but an enemy spellcaster is trying to counterspell it in order to stop your fireball. So what you do is cast counterspell to counterspell your opponent's counterspell, and that way your fireball succeeds in casting. The misunderstanding would be that you're not allowed to cast 2 spells in 1 turn, which is actually not the case. That previous example works perfectly fine. The ruling with not being able to cast any other spells for the rest of the turn is only applied if you use your bonus action to cast a spell, and that's it. As long as your bonus action was not used to cast any spells, then you're free to use as many spells as you want in your turn, assuming you have ways to use additional spells in your turn. Like if you're an Eldritch Knight who uses Action Surge in order to cast 2 spells in 1 turn, using 2 actions. Or if you're trying to counterspell while casting a spell, since counterspell uses your reaction and not your bonus action nor action. And this does also include sorcerers who convert a normal spell into a bonus action with metamagic, which will lock them into only cantrips for their action. So a sorcerer can't bonus action a fireball and then use an action for a fireball. They would have to use their action on a cantrip instead. So this ruling is commonly misunderstood in 2 ways. First off, newer players will usually misunderstand being able to cast other leveled spells after using a bonus action spell. And more advanced players will misunderstand the ruling on not being able to cast 2 times in one turn, because of the specifics of the bonus action spellcasting rule. So just as long as your bonus action is not used to cast a spell, then you're kind of good to go. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other commonly misunderstood rulings, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments, as well as ideas for future videos just like this one.